What made those easy American breakfasts from the 1950s feel so right? They were quick, comforting meals that filled kitchens with warmth and laughter before the day began. When did mornings stop tasting like that? Orange oat. Bran muffins were a bright way to start the day in the 1960s, when many families began exploring healthier options without sacrificing taste. Home bakers loved the natural fiber from bran, and adding fresh orange zest and juice brought a lively citrus kick that felt modern and uplifting. These muffins were made with whole wheat flour, wheat bran, and just enough honey or brown sugar to create a subtle sweetness rather than a dessert-like punch. The texture stayed moist thanks to buttermilk, and the orange peel gave off an aroma that woke up the entire kitchen before the coffee even brewed. Mothers liked serving them warm with a pat of butter or a spoonful of homemade jam, while children enjoyed their gentle sweetness on school mornings. Community cookbooks often featured this recipe, encouraging families to take advantage of readily available oranges shipped in from Florida and California. Orange oat bran muffins reflected the decade's curiosity about nutrition and flavor, proving that healthy could also be inviting and easy to prepare for busy mornings. Cinnamon toast with broiler crisp was one of those forgotten 10-minute breakfasts that once felt fancy, even though it came straight from the bread box. You would take a slice of white bread, butter it generously, sprinkle it with sugar and cinnamon, and slide it under the broiler until the top bubbled and crisped. That was it. No pancake mix, no waffle irons, just the broiler and a little patience. Kids loved it because it felt like dessert. Parents loved it because it was fast, and everyone loved it because it used pantry staples. During the Great Depression and even into the 70s, families relied on simple breakfasts like this to stretch groceries without giving up flavor. The sugar caramelized on top, the bread toasted just enough, and suddenly plain breakfast felt like a treat. You could find versions of it in old community cookbooks, school recipe cards, even homemaker magazines. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of frozen waffles and cereal boxes. Maypo was the hot cereal you either begged for or had to be bribed into eating. It came in a tin with a little cartoon boy on the front, "I want my Maypo," a slogan that somehow made bland maple mush sound exciting. But Maypo was not just food, it was part of the morning ritual. You would stir the mix into hot milk, trying to keep the clumps down, while the house still smelled like someone forgot toast in the oven. For many families, this was a warm and filling meal in the middle of a cold winter, and you would eat it while bundled in flannel pajamas, watching condensation fog up the windows. It was sweet, but not too sweet. A cousin of oatmeal, but somehow both smoother and stranger. And for some kids, it was the only hot thing on the menu before heading off to school. But if you stuck a pat of margarine in the middle and waited for it to melt into a tiny golden crater, you know exactly what I am talking about. That was breakfast. And if hot cereal does not do it for you, maybe you were more of a meat and eggs person. Not bacon, though. Something far less polite. Let's talk Cracklin cornbread. This is the cornbread that absolutely doesn't mess around. Like, this is the supersonic of cornbread. This is that rugged, crispy-edged cousin of your typical cornbread muffin, and it brings with it all the rustic charm that cornbread is always known for. Cracklin cornbread has always come from the innovative kitchens of the working class, and this is especially true in the South, where using anything less than all of the hog was considered culinary blasphemy. Wasting fat? You may as well hang up your butcher knife. It was about no waste, and Cracklins were a prime example of why that mentality worked. These were gold, and stirring them into cornbread only made them shine brighter. It made the bread a lot more filling and gave it extra protein, and you needed that because if you were coming back from a day of shoveling mud, then you definitely needed something for those muscles. It was a proper lunch though, and it was even better with some fresh greens on the side. Cracklin cornbread is something that pretty much has faded into the background nowadays, but it was the perfect kind of thing for when you had nothing but a skillet, an empty stomach, and a lot of grit and determination to make something worth eating. It's a 10 out of 10 for a lot of Southerners, and nothing's really changing that. Bacon fat griddle cakes are something that are pretty much just pure, smoky nostalgia. They're the right kind of greasy. They're visually stunning, and they're full of so much flavor that you'll wonder why people stopped making these in the first place. The best part? They're so good to make on a budget. All that's required for this recipe is some flour, milk, eggs, and just a tad bit of cornmeal, sugar, and maybe molasses if you're really feeling like a dessert king. You're going to have got really old school with the griddle. You take leftover bacon grease instead of any butter or oil, and once your cake's shape is completely done, you just slap them on the griddle. What you get for all your hard, strenuous work is a very crispy-edged, savory and sweet pancake that has a lot of smokiness to it. Each bite feels like a crunch, but the exterior is what's really worth talking about. Obviously, you'd expect something like this to have a fluffy inside, but the exterior is just the perfect start to a delicious bite. Vegetable juice cocktails offered a vibrant start to the day for families who embraced the fresh juicing craze of the 1960s. Homemade blends of carrots, celery, tomatoes, and leafy greens were touted as energizing tonics that delivered vitamins and minerals in every sip. Enthusiastic homemakers and health enthusiasts alike used sturdy kitchen juicers to create bright orange and green drinks that promised natural vitality and a refreshing lift before work or school. Nutrition columns in popular magazines highlighted these colorful cocktails as a way to boost immunity and cleanse the system, a concept that resonated with a generation seeking balance between modern convenience and natural living. Some households added a pinch of cayenne pepper or a splash of lemon juice to sharpen the flavor, while others preferred a milder blend for children. Served chilled in tall glasses with a sprig of parsley for garnish, vegetable juice cocktails became a stylish morning ritual that reflected the optimistic belief that good health could indeed be poured straight from the garden. Peanut butter and honey milk shakes were the quick breakfast booster you would find in every 1960s teen handbook or homemaker guide promising energy in minutes. You would toss peanut butter, milk, and honey into a blender, give it a good mix, and breakfast was done before you could even finish your coffee. It sounds simple now, but back then it was practical, filling, and surprisingly satisfying. Parents loved it because it was affordable and kept teenagers full, and teenagers loved it because it tasted like dessert for breakfast. Some folks added ice or fruit if they had extra, but the basic recipe stayed the same. Peanut butter for protein, honey for sweetness, and milk to bring it all together. It showed up in old cookbooks, school lunch suggestions, and quick breakfast guides long before protein shakes and energy drinks filled grocery aisles. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of modern trends, but back then, it was the kind of breakfast that quietly got families through rushed mornings with nothing but pantry staples and a blender. Grape-Nuts was not a cereal. It was a challenge, a bowl of hard, crunchy nuggets that felt more like punishment than breakfast, unless you knew the trick. You had to soften them with hot water. That was the secret. Pour it in, let it sit, and wait. If you were impatient, you would regret it. Teeth were lost to Grape-Nuts. It was dense, it was earthy, and it never pretended to be fun. But for a generation raised on rationing and stretching every dollar, Grape-Nuts had value. It was filling. It was affordable. And it lasted forever in the pantry. You could mix in some sugar, a splash of milk, maybe a bit of cinnamon if you were feeling fancy. But most days, it was just water and hope. Kids today would call it cardboard. Back then, it was considered hearty. And the weird thing is, some people actually liked it that way. Especially when the weather was cold and the house was quiet. A warm bowl of Grape-Nuts felt kind of grounding. Not exciting, not delicious, just real. But sometimes, when you were lucky or just ran out of options, breakfast came straight from the fridge and straight from dessert. Now, crust coffee soak, on the other hand, is something that is actually wondrous. It's a take on stale bread crusts, and I mean the little leftover bits that almost nobody likes eating, and the idea here is actually pretty interesting. You take those crusts, soak them in hot coffee, sometimes a dash of sugar and a splash of milk, and you actually end up reviving the stale bread crusts completely. It was a very bare-bones dish, don't get me wrong, but it was also surprisingly comfortable if you grew up with it. Think about all the other things you can do with this too, like coffee-soaked bread pudding. Although, if we're being realistic, it's definitely just survival food at its core. You might still find old people today who remember their grandparents making this dish for them, but largely speaking, it wasn't that much of a hit, but it was amazing at saving money and keeping your appetite quiet for just a little while longer. The liver and onions breakfast fry is a strong, unapologetic dish that comes at you with iron, fat, and attitude, which is what the morning needs. Liver slices, practically always beef or pork, are lightly floured and pan-fried, just shy of crunchy on the outside. Tender on the inside, it's all liver, undeniably. Rich, metallic, slightly sweet, extremely savory. Soft onions, caramelized along with or sautéed separately in the same skillet, add a sweetness that balances all that intensity. Often deep-fried in bacon grease or lard, the whole plate is smoky and salty, the depth of flavor more medicinal than indulgent. Some versions add eggs or grits on the side, but the liver and onions are the point. Protein-forward, greasy. It's something that's undeniably as rustic as it is protein-filled. If you like spending your Saturday morning riding the meat express to flavor heaven, then this is definitely a dish for you. Historically, though, this was a meal that people ate when they really needed fuel for all the digging, shoveling, and hauling of the day. Liver was something you could get for a dime a dozen from local butcher shops, and everybody wanted to take advantage of that fact. Vinegar pie for breakfast is something that really just doesn't even sound like a real meal. It honestly sounds like some kind of prank, but no. This is a very real dish, and it actually works in more ways than one. For starters, this doesn't really taste the way you think it would. I know you're imagining some really bitter, acidic notes from the vinegar, but the initial flavor beats are sweet tart, and they give off a very custardy vibe. It's a bit like a lemon chess pie, but just made with your typical pantry staples instead this time. The vinegar is the star of the show, as it should be, and it cuts through almost every other flavor present in the pie, but not to the point where you would think all you can taste here is just vinegar. It's rich. It has this tangy brightness that actually is very stimulating for your taste buds, and if you pair it up with some hot coffee, then it works as well as Bruno Mars does with Anderson .Paak. Vinegar pie is something that strangely, despite being a pretty innovative and flavorful hit, is something that would be called a desperation pie because it's something that was made mostly by the women of the South and the Midwest living in rural populations. Buttered saltine crackers with tea was not a snack. It was survival disguised as sophistication. You would take plain saltines, smear a bit of butter, or margarine if that is all you had, and pair it with a weak cup of tea. That was breakfast. No jam, no eggs, no sides, just crunch and steam. And somehow it worked. This was common in households where the bread ran out early and payday was still a few days away, but it did not feel like scraping the bottom. It felt intentional. A little quiet moment, sitting by the window with a tin of crackers and a chipped teacup. Sometimes, if you were lucky, the butter was soft. Other times it would tear the cracker in half and you would eat it in pieces. It was humble, yes, but not pitiful. That is the thing about old-school breakfasts. They stretched what little you had and made it count. Every bite was a memory. Every sip of lukewarm tea was a tiny reset button for the day ahead. But crackers were just the start. Some mornings, the real magic happened when last night's cornmeal was fried into gold. Molasses milk with soda crackers. Sounds strange now, but for rural families and Depression-era kitchens, it was a fast, practical breakfast when the fridge was nearly bare. You would warm up some milk, stir in molasses for sweetness, and crumble soda crackers right on top. That was it. It was not fancy, but it filled you up, gave you a little energy, and made use of things that lasted forever in the pantry. Molasses was cheaper than sugar and packed with nutrients. Soda crackers were everywhere, and milk, fresh or canned, was always a breakfast staple. Old farm cookbooks, church recipe cards, and rural homemaker guides all had versions of this tucked inside, passed around by folks who knew how to stretch the simplest ingredients. It was humble, filling, and comforting in its own odd way. These days, it is almost unheard of, replaced by granola bars and cereal bowls. But back then, this quiet little breakfast got people through hard mornings with nothing but warm milk and a little ingenuity. Egg white souffle cups. captured the fascination with airy, low-fat creations that defined many health trends of the 1960s. Beaten egg whites were carefully folded with a small amount of cottage cheese or finely grated vegetables, then spooned into individual ramekins and baked until puffed and golden on top while remaining cloud-soft inside. This technique required patience and a steady hand, but rewarded cooks with a striking presentation that felt both luxurious and virtuous. Diet magazines promoted the recipe as a clever way to enjoy a protein-rich breakfast without the heaviness of yolks or rich cream sauces, and many home entertainers used it to impress guests at weekend brunches. The delicate texture and mild flavor invited experimentation with herbs such as chives, dill, or tarragon, letting each cook leave a personal signature on the dish. Egg white soufflé cups stood as a symbol of mid-century optimism, blending elegance and health consciousness in a single airy bite that seemed almost too pretty to eat, yet remained nourishing and satisfying. Carrot raisin. Morning loaf became a beloved quick bread of the 1960s as families searched for ways to add vegetables into everyday meals without sacrificing sweetness or comfort. Grated carrots gave the loaf a vibrant orange color and moist texture, while plump raisins provided natural bursts of sugary flavor that needed little extra sweetener. Whole wheat flour or a blend of flours added fiber and a hearty crumb, and warm spices like cinnamon and nutmeg filled kitchens with a cozy aroma as the loaf baked. Mothers loved how this bread delivered beta-carotene and vitamins in a form children eagerly devoured, often serving it lightly toasted with a thin spread of butter or cream cheese. Weekend brunches and after-school snacks alike benefited from slices of this cheerful loaf, which stayed tender for days and traveled well in lunchboxes. Carrot raisin morning loaf demonstrated the era's inventive approach to wholesome baking, turning simple pantry staples into a bright, nourishing treat that pleased everyone at the table. Maple syrup toast with warmed butter was the farmhouse kitchen's answer to rushed mornings when breakfast still needed to feel comforting, even if the fridge was nearly bare. You would toast a slice of bread, slather on warm butter, and drizzle real maple syrup over the top. That was it. Sweet, buttery, and ready in under 10 minutes. Families loved it because it was practical, made from pantry staples, and good enough to carry you through a long morning of chores, school, or factory work. Some folks added cinnamon, others kept it plain, but either way, it turned toast into something that felt a little indulgent. You could find versions of this in old rural cookbooks, passed down through generations of families who knew how to stretch groceries without cutting corners on comfort. Somewhere along the way, breakfasts like this disappeared under the weight of boxed cereals and fast food menus. But back then, it was one of those quiet meals that actually made mornings bearable. Funny how something so simple could be so easy to forget. Sardines on toast. That is it. That was the breakfast. A few oily, salty fish laid out over a slice of dry toast, sometimes with mustard, sometimes with nothing at all. This was peak efficiency. Sardines came in little tins with pull tabs and olive oil, and once opened, there was no going back. You either learned to love them, or you left the room. But in many households, especially immigrant or coastal communities, sardines were normal. They were rich in protein, did not require refrigeration, and could be eaten cold. They slid out of the can like they were daring you to try them, and once you did, you either never looked back or never forgave your parents. The smell alone would hang in the kitchen like a stubborn ghost, and yet somehow they kept showing up on toast. Bonus points if you smashed them onto toast with a fork and added some black pepper or a squeeze of lemon. That was the deluxe version. For others, it was just fish and bread, plain and honest. Kids would gag. Grandparents would smile. And somewhere in the middle, someone would quietly eat their sardines and be grateful they were not powdered eggs again. It was not about flavor. It was about function. And if that sound of the tin peeling open still triggers memories, you know exactly what kind of breakfast we are talking about. But not every vintage morning started with toast and fish. Some of them started with hot soda, literally. Bread scramble is pretty much one of those moments of sheer creativity, resourcefulness, and making the most out of things that just would never go together if you were adhering to common sense. It's a throw-together breakfast if I've ever seen one. I mean, you would honestly be hard-pressed to not call this survivalist cooking. It's exactly what you might think it is, too. Torn up pieces of bread that's either a day old at best or several at worst tossed up into a hot skillet. Add some butter and bacon grease, then scramble it up to high heaven with some eggs. People would typically add whatever scraps they could to make the meal stand out a bit more. They'd add leftover ham, onions, and different kinds of herbs, and flavor-wise, just think of it like a bread-based omelet. It actually soaks up a lot of the eggs and fat, so it's definitely a lot more flavorful than you would expect, and it gets the job done well enough from what is essentially a very impromptu breakfast. Probably end up with a nasty case of heartburn if you use this recipe regularly, though. Rolled oats and bacon are a really humble and delicious combination. It does two things very perfectly. It balances the comfort of a cream-heavy dish with the allure of smoky flavors. Now, that's not very hard to do, but I think when a dish makes that work, it's always one for the notes app. The oats are something you simmer slowly in water and milk. You know, the usual preparation. You have to wait until it becomes completely porridge, though. Stir in these crisp crumbles of bacon, and suddenly the dish transforms into a wonderful savory fantasy. You get to have this decadent texture with just the tiniest bits of smoky aftertaste, and it makes for a dish that just feels like the perfect autumn or winter breakfast. Historically, though, this is a dish that you would actually find more often in the summer times, when people were really trying to stretch out their meals and scraping for protein. Especially in the early 20th century, when rationing meant that almost everyone had to think conservatively about what they were eating and how much of it they were using. The savory oats bowl couldn't ever go mainstream, but I think that suits the quiet nature of the dish. Grapefruit halves with honey broil offered a burst of sunshine on the plate, perfect for a 1960s morning when families sought a fresh, vitamin-rich start to the day. Large ruby or white grapefruits were sliced in half, segments loosened, and the tops brushed lightly with golden honey before being placed under the broiler. The brief heat caramelized the honey and released the fruit's aromatic oils, creating a warm, slightly tart, and gently sweet treat. This preparation elevated a simple piece of fruit into something special without adding heavy calories, fitting the era's growing awareness of healthy eating. Magazines frequently praise the dish for its vitamin C content and its ability to energize a household before school or work. Some cooks added a dusting of cinnamon or nutmeg, while others served the grapefruit with a side of whole wheat toast to round out the meal. Grapefruit halves with honey broil captured the mid-century belief that a beautiful breakfast could be both nourishing and elegant, proving that simplicity often delivers the brightest flavor. Baked bean toast was the quick, savory breakfast that filled countless plates across New England when mornings were rushed, but you still needed something hot and satisfying. You would toast a slice of bread, spoon on canned baked beans, maybe top it with cheese or butter, and slide it under the broiler. Breakfast was done in under 10 minutes, hearty enough to carry you through a long day. Families loved it because it was affordable, practical, and good enough to stretch one can of beans into a meal for the whole house. Old cookbooks, factory lunch guides, and frugal homemaker magazines all praised this trick for making mornings easy without giving up flavor. Some folks added mustard or hot sauce, others kept it plain, but either way, it was the kind of breakfast that quietly filled bellies when nothing else seemed to last. These days, it barely gets a mention, but back then, baked bean toast was one of those small comforts that made hard mornings feel bearable. Hot Dr. Pepper was real. It was not a prank. It was not a joke. It was an actual breakfast drink, served warm, with a slice of lemon floating on top like it belonged there. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Dr. Pepper Company rolled out ads urging families to heat their soda in a saucepan and drink it like tea. And people did. They poured it into mugs, called it comforting, and sipped it alongside eggs and toast like this was totally normal. There was something oddly cozy about sipping soda that steamed like coffee, even if it tasted like fizzy syrup trying to be sophisticated. It was part science experiment, part nostalgia bomb. One sip, and you were either delighted or deeply confused. It smelled like caramelized chemicals and tasted like soda-flavored syrup with a citrus twist. Kids loved it, adults tolerated it, and on cold winter mornings, it hit the spot. mostly because you had no idea what else to serve. The lemon slice added a whiff of class, even though the whole idea screamed experimental chemistry. If you ever walked into a kitchen that smelled like a candy factory was melting, chances are someone had a pot of soda on the stove. And if that was your idea of a warm beverage, then you are probably still wondering why it disappeared. But hot soda was not the only strange liquid to hit the breakfast table. Some folks poured something even weirder into a glass and called it a meal. Tallow fried potatoes are the OG French fries. They're insanely flavorful. They have that beautiful golden sheen to them, and they're about as crispy as you would want the perfect batch of French fries to be. A lot of that color, vividness, and flavor comes from the fact that they're fried in rendered beef fat instead of vegetable oil. Now, back in the day, and I mean way before the 80s, fast food joints like McDonald's were actually using beef tallow in their fries as well. That was a big part of what gave them that original iconic flavor. Tallow helps potatoes achieve a savory flavor that they would never be able to get to on their own. Plus, this just isn't there today with the modern oils we have. The best part really was the exterior, because a simple first bite was about as close to nirvana as you could get. If you were eating these when you were borderline starving, then you were pretty much about to have the best food experience of your life. Tallow was the go-to frying fat for a lot of American diners and fast food kitchens, and it's just not hard to see why. And then, you ever have leftovers but you don't want to make what you had last night? Mutton sausages are these super earthy, super robust, and unapologetically meaty dishes that offer an entire world of flavor for those willing to traverse its savory depths. They're grounded until they are extremely coarse, and the chew is something that lets you know you're eating something with a lot of flavor in it. Speaking of flavor, this is something that strikes a lot of unique notes. It's grassy, a bit gamey, and extremely savory, but it's seasoned in a very different way. You have blends of parsley, garlic, pepperjack, allspice, even nutmeg in there. People would also make really traditional blends with things like rosemary, black pepper, garlic, and a bit of vinegar. When you would cook these, the fat would slowly render out, and this would baste the meat internally, making it an incredible flavor festival for meat lovers. Cornmeal mush was never glamorous, but slice it, fry it, and suddenly it had presence. The night before, someone would stir cornmeal into boiling water until it thickened into a gloopy, beige brick. You would pour it into a loaf pan, let it sit overnight, and by morning, you had yourself a solid chunk of survival. Slice it up, toss it into a hot skillet with bacon grease or whatever oil you could spare, and fry until the edges got crispy and golden. The inside stayed soft, kind of like polenta that had given up on being fancy. You would top it with syrup, sometimes butter, maybe even a spoonful of jam if you were feeling fancy. And yes, people called it breakfast. It was warm, filling, and made out of almost nothing, which was exactly the point. This was the food of people who could stretch a penny until it squeaked. No waste, no fuss, and no excuses. Banana and wheat germ smoothies were the forgotten health food breakfast from the 1970s, back when nutrition guides promised energy in 10 minutes or less. You would blend a banana with milk, add a spoon of wheat germ, and maybe toss in honey if you had it. That was breakfast, quick, filling, and just trendy enough to feel like you were ahead of the curve. Parents loved it for being affordable, teens liked it for the simplicity, and health fads leaned hard on it as a protein-packed, no-fuss morning meal. It showed up in old diet books, homemaker columns, and those paper recipe handouts at grocery stores. Wheat germ was the health food of its time, promising fiber and nutrients without all the heavy cooking. Smoothies were new enough to feel exciting but easy enough to show up in every busy household. Somewhere along the way, this breakfast got lost behind flashy protein powders and complicated smoothie bowls, but back then, it quietly kept families full with nothing but fruit, milk, and a blender. Sweet potato hash with onions brought bold color and natural nutrition to the breakfast table at a time when Americans were looking for hearty yet healthful alternatives to white potatoes. Cubes of sweet potato were pan-fried until caramelized and golden, mingling with soft sautéed onions that added sweetness and depth. The dish delivered vitamin-rich comfort with every bite while offering a lower glycemic twist on traditional hash browns. Many families seasoned the hash with paprika, black pepper, or a hint of cayenne for subtle spice, while others tossed in chopped bell peppers or fresh herbs for extra freshness. Served alongside poached eggs or a slice of whole-grain toast, sweet potato hash with onions satisfied appetites and brightened plates with its orange hue. Magazines and community cookbooks praised it as both budget-friendly and nutritionally forward, showing how simple vegetables could create a meal worthy of a Sunday brunch or an everyday breakfast that nourished body and spirit. Cream cheese and jelly sandwiches were one of those quiet kitchen tricks passed down from old homemaker guides, perfect for rushed mornings when the fridge looked bare, but breakfast still had to happen. You would take soft white bread, spread on a swipe of cream cheese, and finish it off with grape jelly or whatever jam was on hand. That was it. Served cold or lightly toasted, it was fast, sweet, and filling enough to count. For a lot of families, this sandwich was a saving grace on mornings when eggs were too expensive and cereal boxes were empty. Cream cheese made it creamy, the jelly brought the sweetness, and together they turned plain bread into something that actually stuck with you through the morning. You could find versions of this recipe in old community cookbooks, lunchbox ideas, and school pamphlets reminding parents how to keep breakfast simple. Somewhere along the way, it got pushed aside by granola bars and frozen breakfast sandwiches, but back then, it was a 10-minute meal that worked every time. Funny how those easy, no-fuss breakfasts slipped through the cracks. Ovaltine was for people who wanted hot cocoa, but wound up with vitamins instead. You would scoop the brown powder into a mug, add hot water or milk, and stir, and stir, and stir some more, because it never truly dissolved. You would sip it and still find clumps floating at the top. The taste? Malted, vaguely chocolatey, with a lingering aftertaste of health. But Ovaltine was not just about flavor. It was about promises. The box claimed to make you stronger, smarter, and healthier, all while giving off the vibe of a prescription from your grandma. It was especially popular during the 1940s through the 1960s, when anything that could be fortified with vitamins was instantly approved by parents. And if you were sick, forget it. Ovaltine was coming your way whether you wanted it or not. It was like the soup of the breakfast world, supposedly comforting, vaguely medicinal, and always a little too warm. Kids would pretend to enjoy it, stirring it until the top got cold and the bottom got gritty. And if you ever drank it through a striped straw just to distract yourself, congratulations, you are in the club. But for some families, breakfast was even stranger. It came straight from a can and always smelled like regret. Milk toast is also pretty much exactly what you think it is. Back in the old days, it was so much more common for people to take an intentionally frugal approach to how they spent their food, and especially the kind of hacks, snacks, and dishes they would come up with. All of these ideas were centered around being able to make the most using the least amount of time, energy, and ingredients possible. Milk toast is one of the best examples of that, because imagine if you tried to make the most out of some milk or some bread before it was about to hit those pearly gates and become fully expired. Yeah? You can't really figure out what to do, because while you'd normally just eat them on their own separately, this time that doesn't work. You just go ahead and get milk toast ready. The best part is that it works in 3 different ways. You get a nice healthy meal that's a pretty good breakfast or an interlude meal before your next big meal. You get to save money because you're not letting anything go to waste, nor are you buying something new because these ingredients are probably on their last legs, and you get a pretty lovely dessert out of it too. What's not to like, really? It's kind of insane how convenient milk toast can really be. Mutton fat bread is something that's unapologetically itself. It's too rich, too deep, and it has all the meaty flavors you could ask for. The essence of rendered sheep fat is unmistakable here. It's something that goes perfectly well with day-old bread, slightly dry, a bit hard, and coarse. You know, the entire 9 yards. This is as rustic of a dish as it gets. It absorbs the hot fat in this dish and it crisps on the outside while getting extremely soft on the inside. This dish is something that you would see really commonly whenever you would pass by factory towns or farms. especially among rural laborers, such as people in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were sheep farming regions like the Appalachia, Wales, or the Highlands, and mutton fat was an extremely common ingredient in these areas. That's because it was always far more cheaper than butter, or just a lot more flavorful than lard. The ideal material for frying. The fried bread was also a good way for people to stretch meals, and although some people didn't vibe with the overly gamey taste, back then it was considered a standard of most red meat-based meals. Spinach and mushroom scramble turned a classic egg breakfast into a vibrant, vegetable-filled dish that matched the decade's growing interest in nutritious eating. Fresh spinach leaves were quickly wilted in a hot skillet, earthy mushrooms were sautéed until golden, and then beaten eggs were poured in to create a tender scramble flecked with greens. This hearty combination delivered iron, protein, and a savory depth of flavor that felt both rustic and sophisticated. Families appreciated that it required only a few simple ingredients while offering enough substance to keep everyone energized through school or work. Many homemakers added a small sprinkle of nutmeg or grated cheese to enhance the natural flavors, while health writers encouraged using olive oil instead of butter for a lighter touch. Served with a slice of whole-grain toast or fresh fruit, the spinach and mushroom scramble quickly became a breakfast favorite for those who wanted something more exciting than plain eggs, but less indulgent than a rich omelet. It perfectly showcased how the 1960s embraced vegetables as stars of the morning table. Cottage cheese on toast with pineapple rings was the kind of retro breakfast you would find tucked inside those glossy 1970s women's magazines, always advertised as light, quick, and just fancy enough to feel like you tried. You would toast a slice of bread, scoop on some cottage cheese, and crown the whole thing with a pineapple ring straight from the can. It sounds odd now, but back then it was practical, filling, and passed off as health food, sweet, salty, creamy, and done in under 10 minutes, perfect for busy mornings or when groceries were running low. Housewives loved it for its simplicity, and teenagers liked it for being something different than plain old toast. You could find versions of this popping up at brunch tables, church socials, or just in quiet kitchens trying to stretch a meal. Somewhere along the way, it disappeared under the weight of new diet trends and breakfast bars, but at the time, it was a fast, no-fuss meal that worked. Kellogg's Product 19 was not just cereal. It was a statement. A beige box with a no-nonsense name, it looked like something you would find in a government ration kit. No cartoon tiger, no marshmallows, just flakes. Vitamin-enriched, iron-packed flakes that promised to do everything except taste good. Product 19 was Kellogg's answer to, well, nutrition. A cereal so serious it could only be marketed to adults, or kids whose parents shopped like nutritionists. You knew your friend's house was different when Product 19 showed up on the breakfast table instead of Sugar Pops or Fruit Loops. The texture was dry, the flavor was cardboard, but it made you feel responsible. Like eating it might actually make you taller, or better at math. It was the cereal version of homework, and if you had to suffer through it just to get the toy buried in the box, you earned it. But some families did not even bother with cereal. They just went straight for toast. Not with jam, not with butter, but with something far more intense. Honestly, the fact that nobody is talking about how good molasses toast is these days is certifiably criminal behavior. I just want you to picture hot toast, and I mean real, genuine bread, not packaged, factory-made fluff, but actual freshly baked bread with deep, dark molasses. Not the generic stuff you find in marts and stores nowadays, but actual molasses. Blackstrap, bitter, smoky, sweet, and punchy. This is something brown sugar wishes it could be. Molasses toast is something that was definitely the moment back when it was popular, and those were times when you would consider sugar a luxury. Most folks tried to get it on everything they possibly could, whether that was biscuits, cornbread, hot milk, pies, or toast. The first person to put that stuff on toast hit a gold mine, and everybody copied the blueprint afterwards. The toast was absolutely the move, and butter melting with the molasses created this perfect harmony of sweetness. The bread was the perfect stage for that, and if you had it today, you'd feel like you're going back through time to a farmhouse kitchen in the 40s. You can eat this toast as it is or mix it up with some honey and nuts if you really feel like bringing out your inner chef. Some people also double down on the sugar rush by adding cinnamon and vanilla extract. Beef drippings on toast are the quintessential middle-aged dad breakfast, and I'm referring to a really specific kind of dad too. Beer belly, loaded forearms built over a career of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, and the ability to fall asleep on a floor in jeans and eat literally anything. We all know the type. Beef drippings on toast were a breakfast that people largely made when they were low on materials for anything else. Toast is nice, but people have been hearing about it for literally centuries and, things just get old. People like to spice their toast up. It's only human. It's pretty much just what you would expect, too. Beef drippings are largely a byproduct of bacon and red meat cooking, and people like to scoop that up and preserve it as much as they could. You could pour it over beans, or just about anything, really. It was the kind of thing that would last you through several uncomfortable situations. Having to eat the same bland toast sounds pretty uncomfortable to me. It was also not as meaty or greasy as you would expect. It pretty much just tasted like your regular old beef. And this is what helped it to stay a consistent breakfast option throughout a lot of the 1950s and 1960s. Banana wheat germ smoothies highlighted the superfood status of wheat germ during the 1960s, when Americans became fascinated with nutrient-dense ingredients that promised energy and vitality. Ripe bananas blended smoothly with milk, wheat germ, and a drizzle of honey, creating a naturally sweet drink packed with protein, fiber, and essential vitamins. Early adopters of home blenders loved how quickly they could create a filling breakfast that tasted indulgent while staying true to the health trends of the era. Some adventurous families added a spoonful of peanut butter or a pinch of cinnamon for extra flavor, while others used yogurt instead of milk to boost creaminess and probiotics. This smoothie was particularly popular with teenagers and young athletes who wanted a portable, energizing meal before school or practice. Banana wheat germ smoothies perfectly represented the optimism of the decade, offering a convenient and wholesome way to start the morning that felt modern and nourishing all at once without the need for refined sugars or processed mixes. Wheat germ and yogurt bowls were the health kick of the 1970s that snuck their way into forgotten cookbooks and quick breakfast guides. You would scoop some plain yogurt into a bowl, toss on a spoonful of wheat germ, maybe drizzle honey or sprinkle nuts if you had them, and breakfast was done in minutes. It was quick, packed with protein, and felt ahead of its time back when most breakfasts were still sugar-heavy cereals or toast. The health-conscious crowd loved it because it kept you full, parents liked it because it was easy, and even the kids got on board, mostly because the yogurt cut through the plain, nutty taste of wheat germ. These bowls were everywhere in the 70s, showing up in homemaker magazines, diet guides, and those community cookbooks with spiral bindings. But like a lot of forgotten breakfasts, they slipped away when trends shifted. Now it is all smoothie bowls and protein shakes. It looked like chocolate milk, but it definitely did not taste like it. Carnation instant breakfast came in little single-serve packets that promised energy, nutrition, and enough vitamins to power a small army. Just mix it with milk and boom, breakfast in under 30 seconds. For kids of the 1960s and 1970s, this was practically healthy food. Parents loved it because it was quick, kids tolerated it because it was chocolate-ish, and somewhere along the way it became a cultural artifact. Back then, convenience beat taste every time. If it came in a powder and looked remotely edible, it made it onto the breakfast table. The commercials promised vitality, strong bones, and something vaguely futuristic, like breakfast had become science. It was marketed as an ideal solution for busy mornings. But let's be honest, most of us drank it while staring at the same box of stale cereal we had been ignoring all week. And if you remember drinking it straight from a foggy glass while the milk never quite mixed right, you might be older than you think. But hey, if you thought that was strange, wait until you remember the orange powder astronauts brought to breakfast. Lard biscuits are pretty much the heroes of old-school baking. If you actually look at it from a historical lens, these unapologetically flavorful biscuits have kept way more bellies full than something like turnips. No, but really, lard biscuits have been a generational safety net for when a hunger pang is about to turn a bad day into a bad week. Lard biscuits were the go-to in Southern kitchens for the longest time, even before butter became a staple ingredient in the area. Folks would keep tins of drippings on the stove, but most of the lard was preserved, not because people had to ration it or because they were running awfully short, but because they just liked it that much. Lard biscuits are something you don't see around anymore, but during several of the past few centuries, as well as notable periods like the Great Depression and the World Wars, lard biscuits were man's best friends. Now, parsnip hash is a sweet, savory dish that boggles your mind. Because what really does parsnip hash entail? It's a sweet and savory skillet dish that smells a lot like summer and tastes like something that just came out of a wood-fired stove. Parsnips were diced, fried, and they turned golden at the edges. The idea was to caramelize them until they were just about to be overcooked, because there's this really specific sweet spot between overcooked and just typically caramelized where the flavor gets super concentrated. The end result was a nutty, peppery, and sweet dish that was honestly to die for. If you're looking for something healthy to add to your diet, this is also a wonderful option. And historically speaking, it's always been something people ate throughout the winter to keep their health strong, their immune system locked in, and their bellies full. Some people definitely prefer things completely vegetarian, and this is a pretty amazing way to go about it. If you're looking for some inspiration for your meal plan, then there's no better or healthier dish to start out with than turnip hash. Also, if you do end up trying this, you absolutely have to share the experience in the comments. I'm low-key dying to know what turnip hash is like. Buttermilk cornmeal. Griddle cakes carried the warmth of Southern kitchens into a decade eager to celebrate regional flavors with a wholesome twist. Whole grain cornmeal gave these cakes a gentle crunch and rich yellow hue, while tangy buttermilk kept the interior tender and moist. Cooked on a hot cast iron griddle, they developed a lightly crisp edge that paired beautifully with a drizzle of warm maple syrup or a spoonful of fruit preserves. Many families found them heartier than traditional pancakes, offering natural fiber and a subtle nutty flavor that satisfied appetites well into the morning. Newspaper food sections highlighted the recipe as an ideal way to enjoy old-fashioned flavor while keeping an eye on modern nutrition, encouraging cooks to serve them with fresh berries instead of heavy butter. Weekend breakfasts often featured stacks of these golden cakes accompanied by a pot of strong coffee and lively conversation, proving that tradition and health could meet in one delicious meal without compromise. Oatmeal with brown sugar and cream was about as classic as breakfast could get. Quick oats simmered on the stove, topped with a spoonful of brown sugar and a splash of canned milk. It was ready in 10 minutes flat, cheap to make, and warm enough to shake off the worst winter mornings. Families across America leaned on this breakfast when budgets were tight, but everyone still needed something filling to start the day. Quick oats cooked faster than traditional oats, brown sugar gave just enough sweetness, and canned milk made the whole thing creamy even if fresh milk was hard to come by. It showed up in school lunch guides, frugal homemaker magazines, and those old cookbooks buried at the back of every kitchen drawer. For a lot of folks, this was not a special occasion breakfast. It was the daily routine, quiet, dependable, and gone in under 10 minutes. Funny how something so ordinary could disappear so completely, replaced by instant packets and flashy coffee shop menus. Ricotta and berry crepes brought a gentle European elegance to American mornings in the 1960s when home cooks looked for lighter ways to impress family or guests without heavy frying or sugary batters. Thin crepes were cooked in well-seasoned pans until just golden, then filled with creamy ricotta cheese lightly sweetened with a touch of honey and a squeeze of lemon for brightness. Fresh seasonal berries such as strawberries, raspberries, or blueberries added a vibrant burst of color and natural sweetness, creating a breakfast that felt fancy but was surprisingly simple to make in any modest kitchen. Many magazines of the decade praised this dish for its balance of protein and fruit, noting how it satisfied hunger while still feeling delicate and refined. Weekend brunch gatherings often featured these crepes as a centerpiece, offering a taste of continental sophistication without the need for expensive ingredients. Ricotta and berry crepes perfectly captured the optimistic spirit of the era, showing that health and indulgence could share the same plate and start the day on a graceful note. Hardtack might sound like a pirate snack, and honestly, you wouldn't be wrong. This rock-hard cracker was a staple for soldiers, sailors, and settlers alike. Anyone who needed food that could last months or even years. Made simply from flour and water, hardtack was famously tough to chew, earning nicknames like tooth duller and molar breaker. But here's where things got clever. To make this bland biscuit remotely edible, people would soak it in water, milk, or even coffee to soften it up. Now add a generous smear of honey or syrup, and suddenly you've got a sweet treat that feels like a luxury in hard times. Back in the day, honey was nature's candy, and drizzling it over softened hardtack transformed survival food into a breakfast comfort. So why did it disappear? Well, once fresher options and modern preservation methods came along, hardtack lost its charm. Plus, people today aren't exactly thrilled about eating something that requires pre-soaking unless it's oatmeal. Supermarkets brimming with fluffy pastries and freshly baked bread have pushed this once practical dish into just a figment of history. Quick cornmeal. Mush was one of those Depression-era breakfasts that showed up in every rural cookbook and farmhouse kitchen when groceries ran low, but mornings still demanded something hot and filling. You would stir cornmeal into boiling water, cook it down to a thick, creamy consistency, and top it with butter, syrup, or even just a pinch of salt. Breakfast was done in 10 minutes flat, and somehow it stuck with you for hours. Families loved it because cornmeal was cheap, easy to store, and stretched into a satisfying meal without much effort. Some folks called it polenta, others called it mush, but it always worked the same: practical, no fuss, and surprisingly comforting. It filled bellies through winters, long work days, and school mornings when cereal was not an option. You could find versions of this recipe in old homemaker magazines, church fundraisers, and even government pamphlets reminding families how to get by with less. It is one of those breakfasts that quietly disappeared, replaced by boxed mixes and quick-fix meals. But back then, it kept people going. Cottage cheese and peach plates became a cheerful staple in diners and home kitchens across America during the 1960s as people searched for figure-friendly breakfasts with a touch of elegance. Served cold on simple white plates, the combination of creamy cottage cheese and juicy sliced peaches offered a balance of protein, calcium, and natural sweetness that felt almost luxurious. Fresh peaches were ideal when in season, but canned peaches packed in light syrup made the dish accessible year-round, making it a favorite for mothers trying to provide a wholesome breakfast even in winter. Many diet magazines of the era promoted it as a high-protein, low-fat meal that could keep energy steady through a long morning without heavy starches or greasy sides. Some cooks added a sprinkle of cinnamon or a drizzle of local honey for extra flavor, while health-conscious diners often paired it with a small glass of tomato juice or herbal tea. This breakfast captured the optimism of the decade and the emerging desire for meals that nourished without weighing anyone down. Buttered cornflake toast was one of those forgotten 10-minute breakfasts that once lived in every kid's cookbook or church bulletin. You would toast a slice of soft white bread, slather it with butter or peanut butter if you had it, then smash some cornflakes on top. That was it. Crunchy, sweet, filling, and ready before the school bus pulled up. It was not some gourmet recipe, just a quick fix that felt special on rushed mornings. Most families kept cereal on hand anyway, and this was a way to stretch it when the grocery budget was tight. Sometimes parents sprinkled sugar on top, other times it was plain, but either way, it turned leftover cereal into breakfast that actually stuck with you. You could even swap peanut butter for jam or just plain butter, depending on what was left in the fridge. These kinds of quick breakfasts were everywhere in old cookbooks. Simple, made from pantry staples, and good enough to get everyone out the door without complaints. Tang was not just a drink, it was a vibe. A wildly artificial, suspiciously orange-colored powder that turned a glass of water into something vaguely citrus-flavored. Kids in the 1960s thought it was what astronauts drank in space, and that made it cool. Never mind the fact that it tasted like melted vitamin gummies mixed with sidewalk chalk. This was cutting-edge science in a cup. You would stir it in and watch it cloud up, like some kind of glowing chemical experiment. Parents told themselves it was fortified, but what it really fortified was the belief that flavor was optional. If you had tang with toast, you know that was a bold pairing. Dry on dry, sugar on sugar. But that was the thing. Back then, meals did not always have to make sense. They just had to fill you up and keep the kids quiet before school. And if you ever double-dipped your toast into a glass of tang because milk was out, then buckle up. Because we are about to enter the world of hot cereal that came with a mascot and a warning label. So we're going to start our list off with a classic that everyone's familiar with. Stale bread pancakes, and you might be surprised how people made pancakes out of bread, but it's an interesting little process that'll show you just how resourceful we really could be. They're also surprisingly tasty, and the idea here is to soak slices or cube-sized chunks of stale bread in milk, and when even that's not available, water, then mash it up with eggs. You need a little bit of flour for this to work, and whatever extra flair you want to add to it is your own preference. Personally, I always go for some honey. These pancakes are something that isn't just exclusive to American tables either. They're a tradition that stretches from so many different cultures across the world that it's simply just a grandpa meal now. Plus, flavor-wise, these go with any kind of game plan. You can sprinkle some cheese, throw in different kinds of herbs like parsley and oregano for a more aromatic pancake, or go savory with salt and pepper. Everything works, and they're awfully cheap, so why not? Tomato and herb omelet celebrated the fresh flavors of backyard gardens and farmers markets that became increasingly popular during the 1960s as more families embraced local produce. Eggs were whisked until light and airy, then folded around ripe tomatoes and fragrant herbs such as parsley, chives, or tarragon, creating a dish that looked as vibrant as it tasted. This omelet delivered plenty of protein and vitamins while allowing home cooks to highlight seasonal vegetables without spending extra money on expensive meats. The bright acidity of the tomatoes balanced beautifully with the soft texture of the eggs, and the aroma of herbs filled the kitchen with an inviting, savory scent. Some households added a sprinkle of mild cheese like Farmer cheese or Monterey Jack for a creamy touch, but many preferred the clean, vegetable-forward simplicity that felt new and healthy. Weekend brunches often featured this dish alongside fresh fruit or a slice of whole-grain toast, making it a favorite for both family breakfasts and casual entertaining. Tomato and herb omelet embodied the decade's enthusiasm for wholesome meals that showcased natural flavors. Applesauce toast with nutmeg was the frugal breakfast tucked inside every homemaker column and Depression-era guide when groceries ran low but mornings kept coming. You would toast a slice of bread, smear it with applesauce, sprinkle a little nutmeg on top, and breakfast was done in under 10 minutes. It was practical, filling, and sweet enough to feel comforting when everything else felt stretched thin. Families leaned on meals like this when fruit was scarce, budgets were tight, and creativity had to carry the kitchen. Applesauce lasted longer than fresh fruit, nutmeg added warmth, and toast turned it all into a quick meal that actually filled you up. It was not fancy, but it worked, and you could find it everywhere from farm kitchens to city apartments. Some folks added butter, others kept it plain, but either way, it was one of those quiet little breakfasts that made hard mornings feel a little easier. These days, applesauce toast barely gets a mention, but back then it quietly carried families through. Leftover pie was not a rebellion, it was a decision. A choice made in kitchens where rules were more of a suggestion and sugar was always welcome. You would open the fridge in the morning, see that lonely wedge of apple or cherry pie sitting on a plate, and suddenly breakfast made itself. No need to reheat, no shame. Just grab a fork and go. Pie for breakfast felt like getting away with something. And maybe it was. But no one questioned it because it made sense. Fruit, check. Carbs, check. A little bit of joy to start the day? Absolutely. Parents might roll their eyes, but they would take a bite too. It was efficient, especially if someone forgot to buy cereal. And let us be honest, some pies tasted better cold anyway, especially when you were too tired to toast anything and too hungry to wait. The crust would flake just enough, The filling would still hold together, and the coffee would cut right through the sweetness. I think the most intimate food experience for anyone from the South is easily just hominy grits. Like, these are definitely a Southern ride or die as far as breakfast is considered. Creamy, loaded with corn and customizable in about 1,000 different ways, there's a lot that hominy grits bring to the table that other dishes just don't seem to compare to. And that too on a budget. They're made from hominy, which is essentially just dried corn that's been treated with an alkaline solution and then grounded into coarse grits. And when cooked slowly with water, milk, and broth, they actually turn into this incredibly thick, fantastic porridge that's worth its weight in gold. What makes hominy grits really stand out is their sheer versatility, though. I mean, the possibilities are quite literally endless. You can go the savory route or the super sweet route, and all you have to do is just add a bit more of whatever spices, seasonings, and herbs you're working with. Hominy grits are so effective largely because they were a Native American creation. The tribes were making hominy a long time before any Europeans set foot on American soil, and they helped to popularize the tradition, which is how it turned into a go-to for Southern kitchens by the 19th century. Ham and red-eye gravy is something that's considered a Southern classic. It has a really bold, salty personality, and it's a very no-nonsense flavor profile as well. This is a dish that takes country ham, which is typically dry-cured and goes the pan-frying route. The idea is to fry it until you see those dark brown edges crisping up in the pan. After that, you get an incredible flavor explosion in the form of concentrated pork drippings, and these then take a further unexpected turn. You start to pour in strong black coffee. Now I know you're about to fast forward 10 seconds, but hear me out, okay? The result isn't creamy or thick like you would expect. The coffee ends up deglazing the pan, and it creates this super thin reddish-brown gravy that has an unmistakable sheen to it. The result is a punchy, smoky, and bitter-tasting gravy, but not overwhelmingly bitter, and the coffee cuts through a lot of the richness of the ham fat. This is something you would see so commonly among rail workers in Tennessee and Alabama, especially if it was in the afternoon hours. The caffeine really helped with the job. Whole wheat buttermilk pancakes brought hearty goodness to the breakfast table when families wanted the comfort of pancakes without the heaviness of refined white flour. The 1960s saw a growing interest in whole grains, and cooks experimented with blending wheat flour into traditional batters to create a nutty flavor and a pleasant, earthy aroma. Buttermilk added tang and tenderness, ensuring each pancake was fluffy yet filling, a perfect canvas for fresh fruit or a drizzle of warm maple syrup. Many homemakers liked that these pancakes kept children satisfied well past lunchtime thanks to their higher fiber content, which was a talking point in health columns and women's magazines of the time. Recipes often suggested adding chopped apples, sliced bananas, or even sunflower seeds for a crunchy twist, while some adventurous cooks folded in a pinch of cinnamon for gentle spice. Whether served on a lazy Saturday morning or a busy weekday, whole wheat buttermilk pancakes reflected a forward-thinking spirit that embraced nutrition while honoring the familiar joy of a classic American breakfast stack. Scrambled eggs with evaporated milk were one of those frugal breakfasts tucked inside old homemaker guides and church fundraisers from the 1940s through the 70s. The secret was canned milk. You would crack your eggs, whisk in a splash of evaporated milk, and fry them up fast. The milk made them fluffy, rich, and stretch further than plain eggs alone. This mattered more than people today might think. During wartime and lean grocery weeks, a can of evaporated milk was gold. It lasted longer than fresh milk, cost less, and made ordinary eggs feel like a treat. Some families tossed in herbs or cheese if they had extra, but most kept it plain. Soft eggs with just a little salt and pepper. Quick, simple, and done in under 10 minutes. You will not find this recipe on Instagram or in trendy brunch spots, but it kept families fed and mornings moving. People used what they had, made it work, and turned humble ingredients into something satisfying. Scrapple was breakfast for the brave. It came in a brick, gray, speckled, and confusing to anyone who had not grown up with it. But for folks in Pennsylvania and parts of the Mid-Atlantic, this was a morning staple. Scrapple is what happens when you take pork scraps, cornmeal, flour, and spices, mash it into a loaf, and fry slices until they are crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. It is not pretty, it is not delicate, but it is undeniably part of American food history. You would eat it with eggs, or sometimes just on its own, maybe with ketchup or syrup, depending on how adventurous you were feeling. And it did what breakfast was supposed to do. It filled you up and kept you going. No fancy branding, no cartoon mascots, just a slab of meat mush and a hot skillet. It was Depression-era ingenuity at its tastiest. And if the smell of it frying in lard brings you back to a yellow-tinged kitchen with loud pans and louder parents, then you already know. But scrapple was not the only strange slab to hit the table in those days. Some of them even came in boxes pretending to be cereal. Today, we're going to be diving into one of the most unexpected combinations from an old-school kitchen. Yup, fried apples and onions. Those sweet, tender apples and savory caramelized onions make for a much better meal than you would originally think. As they sizzle together in a skillet covered with buttery richness, the dish becomes the peak of comfort food when times are hard and you don't have much in the pantry. This dish is actually something that goes back all the way to the 19th century, specifically in the Appalachian and southern regions, where it was very common in kitchens to make the most of whatever was available. Apples were something that was plentiful, and onions were dirt cheap, so the combination made all the sense in the world when you looked at it from your wallet's point of view. Beef kidney stew is a rich, earthy dish that has a lot to bring to the table. Bold, distinctly old-fashioned flavors, and more protein than your muscles probably know what to do with. It gives a really deep umami base. It has a little bit of a mineral flavor, slightly metallic, that's par for the course when you're dealing with actual meat. But you throw this into a skillet with some slow-cooked onions, garlic, red wine, and bay leaves, and you'll end up with this incredibly exotic-looking stew. Dark, glossy, and full of flavor, it's something that has a velvety texture also, thanks to being thickened by flour. The chunks of soft, tender carrot and potato in there also give it an incredible contrast that the dish really needs. Now, historically, this has always been a staple of the working class, especially when you go into the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, beef kidney stew is something that's not really relevant outside of the usual TikTok bringing back age-old recipes. Date nut bread. Slices with cream cheese combined natural sweetness with satisfying texture, earning a beloved spot on 1960s breakfast tables from coast to coast. This quick bread was made with chopped dates for gentle caramel notes and crunchy walnuts for heartiness, baked into a loaf that filled kitchens with a warm, toasty aroma. Once cooled, thick slices were spread with a generous layer of smooth cream cheese, creating a balance of earthy nuts, sweet fruit, and creamy tang that felt indulgent yet wholesome. It was especially popular for school mornings when parents wanted a filling option that traveled well in lunchboxes or could be enjoyed on the way to work. Community recipe books often highlighted it as a clever way to use pantry staples, and many cooks swapped in whole wheat flour to boost the nutritional value even further. Whether toasted lightly or served plain, date nut bread slices with cream cheese provided fiber, protein, and a comforting taste of home that perfectly suited the optimistic, health-conscious spirit of the decade. Apple ring pancakes were straight out of those old Betty Crocker cookbooks and Sunday church potlucks that every neighborhood seemed to have. You would slice an apple into thick rings, dip them in pancake batter, and fry them up on the griddle. The result was a warm, fluffy pancake wrapped around sweet fruit, all ready in under 10 minutes. Kids loved them because it felt like dessert for breakfast, and parents loved them because they used what was already in the fridge. Apples were easy to keep on hand. Batter came together fast, and the whole thing cost next to nothing. Some folks dusted them with powdered sugar, others kept it plain, but either way, it was a breakfast that disappeared fast. These showed up everywhere, from rural farmhouses to suburban kitchens, quietly filling plates long before frozen waffles and toaster pastries took over. It is one of those breakfasts you do not hear about anymore. But back then, it was a reliable way to start the day. Butter was a luxury. Margarine was suspicious. But bacon grease? That was breakfast gold. If you had a metal canister on the stove filled with congealed fat and a strainer on top, you already know where this is going. Toast with bacon drippings was a rite of passage. Crispy white bread smeared with yesterday's leftover lard, sometimes sprinkled with salt, sometimes just eaten as is. It was smoky, greasy, and completely satisfying. And back then, no one cared about saturated fats or cholesterol levels. The grease was recycled like liquid currency. Families kept it in old coffee tins or jelly jars, and if you ever scooped a thick glob of solid bacon fat onto toast and watched it melt into the bread like butter from another planet, then yes, you might be old. This was fuel for a long day, and it came with that unmistakable aroma that clung to your clothes long after the plate was clean. You did not waste anything. That was the rule. If you had bacon, you kept the grease. If you had grease, you made toast. And if you were really lucky, you had something even fancier waiting in the freezer. It came in a yellow box, and all you had to do was Lego. Hot water fried cornmeal cakes are an old-school Southern staple that don't really get even half the love and attention they should these days. I just want you to visualize a crispy, golden brown cornmeal cake with the most incandescent exterior you've ever seen, and then a tender, soft center that just leaves you wanting more and more. But it's natural, and even good, to get curious. And when you hear hot water fried anything, your first instinct is to immediately go like, wait, what? And I really wouldn't blame you. The practice of making cornmeal cakes this way is something that actually goes back several centuries, right back to the enslaved African Americans in the South who were making the first versions of these. Without access to proper feed, not even leavening, they found a way to make do with just cornmeal and water, and these were also known by a much more popular name, hoe cakes. Now, in the end, they started to fall out of everyone's go-to cooking preferences, but I think cornmeal cakes have one more comeback in them, despite it all. Cold potato with an onion salad was basically the chic way to go vegetarian back then. The dish had a subtle charm that heavily relied on the texture and seasoning. It was also ideally served chilled, because, well, science. I'm just kidding, but basically, the starch starts to firm up. This gives the potato a much more dense and sometimes waxy bite that contrasts really well with the creamy dressings. It also works spectacularly with the flavors present in an onion salad, which honestly adds the perfect crunchy element. Cold potatoes can feel like a mush fest after a few bites, so having some alternative textures in there really helps smoothen everything along. Historically, cold potato and onion salad is something we likely derived from 18th century Europe. This is a pretty traditional recipe in German and French circles, and leftover boiled potatoes were always dressed in oil, vinegar, and herbs so that waste could be avoided. American potato salads are something that evolved from these traditions, and they gained a lot of popularity by the time of the 20th century as a potluck, picnic, and community dinner staple. Muesli-style cold cereal introduced a European influence to American kitchens during the 1960s, attracting health-minded eaters eager for something different from sugar-coated boxed cereals. Inspired by Swiss traditions, this breakfast featured raw rolled oats mixed with chopped nuts, dried fruit, and sometimes grated apple, all soaked in milk or yogurt overnight. The result was a cool, creamy bowl that delivered natural sweetness and a variety of textures without heavy sweeteners or artificial flavors. Dietitians praised its high fiber content and the slow-release energy that kept families full through busy mornings, a welcome contrast to the quick sugar rush of many commercial cereals. Home cooks often customized their blends, adding almonds, raisins, or sunflower seeds depending on what was available, which made it both economical and personal. Served chilled and often topped with fresh berries or a drizzle of honey, muesli-style cold cereal represented the adventurous side of 1960s breakfast culture, combining European elegance with practical American thrift in a single satisfying meal. Peanut butter and banana on toast was not just a breakfast. It was a survival trick hidden in government pamphlets and school lunch guides from decades past. You toasted a slice of bread, slathered on peanut butter, and sliced up a banana right on top. It sounds basic now, But during hard times, this was protein, potassium, and energy in one affordable package. Families loved it because it was cheap, quick, and used things every pantry had on hand. The United States Department of Agriculture even recommended it for busy families when money was tight but mornings were busier. Sometimes folks sprinkled sugar or honey over it. Other times they kept it plain. Either way, it filled your belly fast and kept you going. It never made the glossy magazine spreads, but it was reliable, frugal, and good enough to get a generation out the door. These days, breakfasts come frozen or boxed, but back then, a piece of toast and a banana could carry you through the morning. Puffed rice cereal was shot from guns. That was not a joke. That was the actual slogan. And if that sounds dramatic, it is because cereal marketing in the mid-20th century was off the rails. You would open a tall tin can, yes, a literal metal can of cereal, and pour out a mound of puffed air disguised as breakfast. Puffed rice was bland, had the texture of packing peanuts, and got soggy 5 seconds after milk hit it. But kids ate it by the bowlful. Why? Because the name sounded dangerous and the commercials were wild. There was something thrilling about knowing your cereal had been blasted into existence with air cannons and then sealed in a tin like military rations. Plus, it made a great sound when it hit the bowl. The taste? Forgettable. But in a time when breakfast had to stretch and shelf life mattered more than flavor, puffed rice did its job. You could eat it dry, throw some sugar on top, or mix it with something else entirely. And for families who grew up on wartime habits and post-war marketing, it was a compromise that stuck around. But not everything from that era was dry or crunchy. Some breakfasts were warm, brown, and stirred in circles. Stewed tomatoes on bread were something created out of thrift necessity, but they ended up being such a massive comfort food for the people that they stuck around. Tomatoes are often canned, right? That didn't used to be a thing until like the 60s, and that's why people really wanted to try out this new variant of tomatoes. They were slow-cooked, fresh with onion, butter, and bacon fat. Some people would go the extra mile, add a bit of sugar and salt, sometimes a hint of spice and vinegar, or take on a really rich and slightly sweet flavor. As these would tend to simmer, they would soften into this thick, chunky sauce that was kind of juicy but not really watery, and it had a really nice acidity to it. It helped that whatever flavors were there would cling really hard to the tomatoes. The simmering process would help them soften into this thick, chunky sauce too, and it went wild with white bread or cornbread. The bread was perfect for absorbing all of that up like a sponge, and that's what made this such a staple throughout the Depression and throughout a lot of the southern areas. Tomatoes are something that nobody ever really runs out of, and stewing them on bread is something that's a forgotten classic for getting through a hungry day. Molasses-sweetened oatmeal brought a deep, comforting flavor to breakfast bowls at a time when families were looking for hearty yet wholesome ways to start the day. Old-fashioned oats were simmered slowly in milk or water until creamy, then enriched with a spoonful of dark molasses that added iron, minerals, and a rich sweetness unlike refined sugar. The aroma of warm oats and molasses filled the kitchen, promising a meal that could sustain even the busiest mornings. Parents appreciated its low cost and high nutritional value, while children enjoyed its naturally caramel-like taste. Some households stirred and sliced bananas